This is a very strange time to be talking about real news and fake news with everything else that's been going on, and particularly the unfolding drama at Twitter, I guess. But maybe it's the right time to talk about all of this as well. So let's get into it. So we've talked obviously over the last few weeks about the way that journalism has adopted social media, has adapted to social media logics, has been drawn into social media logics. We've talked last week about live blogging, particularly as a particular form of a blending of journalism with social media practices. We'll move on to another form that's arguably emerged in full over the last few years, and that's fact-checking. Now, in a previous week, I've talked already quite a bit about the rise of fake news as a problem, of course, and gradually and really with perhaps a few years of delay, we've then seen the rise of fact-checking organizations, fact-checking practices to address this to a certain extent. Maybe not entirely successfully, certainly not in a way that's made fake news, mis and disinformation go away, but certainly this has had some level of impact, obviously, on both the circulation of problematic news and other mis and disinformation, and the way that people have engaged with that kind of content. So that's, again, another new form of activity for journalists and others, but in a news space that has emerged over the last little while, and we'll speak quite a bit about this today. And then, as we go on from here in these last few weeks of the semester, I want to take more of a step back and really think about the role of news, of journalism, of social media, of news and journalism on social media in the broader public sphere, or whatever the public sphere has become in this emerging and changing media environment as well. So that's the process from here, and of course really what we need to start with is this whole question of facts, of fact-checking, of what these processes, these practices actually are, and how they fit into or possibly sit alongside journalism and the news as well. So this is a typical example of what a fact-check site looks like, obviously. This is the famous claim made by Boris Johnson that Britain would save £350 million a week by leaving the EU, and that all of this could be invested in the NHS, the National Health Service, which obviously didn't happen, as we all know. And this is a site called Full Fact that fact-checked that claim. You see there, this is the verdict. It's not, an entirely false claim, it has to be said. They're saying, well, it's not 350 million, it's 250 million a week, which is still a solid amount of money. But then they're also, of course, going on and saying, well, the impact on the economy from changes to trade after leaving the EU is likely to be far bigger than savings from the UK's membership fee. And, well, by now I think that's become very clear, of course, to most people, even the most avid Brexiteers. So that's a typical example of fact-checking, picking a statement by a politician that claims certain things. Often, in fact, they use statistics as well to make these claims. So picking these sorts of statements, picking these kinds of claims, and then checking them against the available facts. And as it says there in the title, they say this is a clear misuse of official statistics. So in essence, this is cherry-picking certain data from the official statistics, but misrepresents them, and thereby gives voters, gives the general public the wrong impression, or a very skewed and biased impression, of course. So that's, you're probably, I'm guessing, reasonably familiar with these sorts of things. They happen in most countries, in most contexts these days. They certainly happen here in Switzerland as well, and across the EU. And of course, well beyond that as well, there are now fact-checkers pretty much all the way around the world. But this is the kind of the core practice, essentially, that we tend to see, and this is what these sorts of sites if they work as standalone sites, look like. But that's not quite the only story, of course. Fact checks don't just exist on these independent sites like Full Fact, but many more mainstream news organizations, for instance here the BBC as a public broadcaster, have begun to run these kinds of fact checks as well. So here is a statement from a barrister saying, well, you know, there will need to be a second referendum before Britain can leave the EU. Obviously that's turned out not to be true. And this is, in fact, the fact check that they then provide. It's far from clear that there is any kind of legal requirement. Obviously, as it's turned out, there didn't need to be a second referendum for Britain to leave the EU. So that's a slightly different story of a fact check actually run within and by a news organization rather than by an external third-party operation. And both of these models are fairly common by now. Many news outlets have some sort of fact-checking unit now that they've set up, particularly perhaps in the US, where there's been a particular need for this sort of thing in recent years. But of course, we've also seen the growth of a whole cottage industry, if you like, of third-party fact-checkers that have emerged really over the last few years. And of course, one of the most famous cases of this, speaking of the US, was the whole debate that you might remember from the very early days of the Trump presidency when Donald Trump and the White House claimed that this was the biggest crowd ever at an inauguration ceremony, and outlets like The Guardian simply put the Obama and the Trump crowd side by side visually and showed very clearly that no, it wasn't. And this was obviously, again, a false claim by Trump and by his lackeys. In fact, this is, again, from a standalone fact-checking site from PolitiFact. The claim by the then press secretary, Sean Spicer, saying this was the largest audience to witness an inauguration period. And the result was basically that they gave it a pants on fire rating, saying this is absolutely and categorically untrue. So again, this is, the sort of the typical kind of approach perhaps to doing fact checking, taking these fairly clear statements from politicians and others in politics, and then checking them against the available facts, and often providing maybe not quite such a comical rating as this, but providing some level of rating, some kind of verdict that says in very plain language, is this true or not? Or perhaps also, is this kind of somewhat true but exaggerated, overblown, misleading, or whatever else as well. So these are the sorts of approaches basically that fact checkers take. And again, this is obviously from a standalone website that's associated with the Poynter Institute, whereas the previous image that I showed you was from The Guardian, from a mainstream news site. So both of these options are certainly possible. And if you followed, of course, the last few years, particularly of the Trump presidency, fact checkers have been very busy. This is an article, well, a piece in the New York Times. I'm not sure that we can call it an article, which just for the first year of the Trump presidency identified and tried to debunk each and every one of Donald Trump's lies or falsehoods over the course of that year. And as you see there from the screenshot there, it cuts off just in February. So that whole block of text is basically just for misstatements in January 2016. And if you can see it just about, perhaps each of those statements has a link attached to it that tries to debunk one of those falsehoods. So this is very labor-intensive ultimately, particularly when you've got people like Donald Trump and others who very regularly spout falsehoods, of course. So this is not an easy task for fact-checkers, for journalists who might be drawn into the fact-checking world as well. It's simply a lot of work, and it may still not have a massive impact on the people who follow that politician, Trump in this case. because they might also inherently disbelieve the New York Times, of course. So there is a question, and we'll get back to that later, about whether this is really particularly effective or whether it just really ends up desensitizing people almost to those lies because there's just so many of them. In fact, this is from a related article on the New York Times as well, where basically they just looked at the first 40 days of the Trump presidency and said, well, essentially within that time, he told a lie or a falsehood, and we can argue about whether there's really a distinction between lies and falsehoods there that's meaningful, but over the first 40 days, he basically told at least one lie every day, and the first day without a public lie or falsehood was the 1st of March when he went golfing at Mar-a-Lago and then jetted off to a trip through the Middle East and Europe. So this is again, particularly with characters like Trump, this is a very tough task to debunk and follow all of that and not just get drawn into reporting these lies as if they were true. And that's really, of course, what politicians like this are counting on, that at some point journalists simply lose the will or the capacity to fact-check everything that they're saying so that these falsehoods can be disseminated without debunking, without anyone saying, no, that's false. There is in fact, this is a well-known technique by politicians to essentially overwhelm the media environment with so many statements, so many falsehoods that not everything can be checked anymore. That's really, I think, part of Donald Trump's success, particularly as well in getting elected and being president. So this is the challenge, essentially, that fact-checkers face. And of course, yes, Trump and the US is a particularly extreme case, but many other politicians around the world, particularly those who are somewhat less scrupulous, and those who take a more perhaps populist and propagandist approach to their politics, are doing very much the same. Perhaps not quite at this rate, but certainly are doing something very much the same. And that's really the reason that fact-checking, of course, has emerged over the last few years. And by the way, just not to kind of get too fixated on Donald Trump, but this is the not quite the latest update from the Washington Post, but this is now from the end of his presidency at least, and they counted over 30,000 false statements over the course of this. Over the course of the presidency, basically. So, given that, again, there is no fact-checking unit in the world that can fact-check 30,000 statements within 4 years, of course. These guys have certainly tried, and they've at least identified them, but it is just incredibly difficult to do this. And of course, whether or not they're getting fact-checked, they will still circulate in circles who support Donald Trump and may well change people's views of the world, people's beliefs, people's ideologies, to support, the candidate. So that's really the size of the challenge ultimately that we're dealing with in all of this, of course. Just another example. So I don't want to give you too many examples here, but this is what it looks like, for instance, in Australia, where the national public broadcaster, the ABC, is publishing these kinds of fact checks as well. And again, there you see a clear rating. And this is kind of an interesting one because there is also a gray area, of course. It's not just everything is false or true, but things can be taken out of context. Things can be, as in this case, exaggerated. And so this poses another challenge for fact checkers. It's not just black and white, it's not just right or wrong, but of course it's simply possible to fudge the figures to provide a particular reading, a particularly biased reading perhaps of the figures to make these kinds of claims. And that's a lot harder for fact checkers than to come to a clear verdict and say, well, yes, there's some truth to this, but it's taken out of context, it's exaggerated or whatever. That makes their work even harder, of course. And that's, again, to some extent what politicians count on as they're doing this kind of work. All right. So I may already have answered this question a little bit by giving you these examples, but of course, yes, we need to ask, well, why is this happening now? Perhaps why have these politicians emerged over the last 5 or so years, maybe a little bit more by now, and what can be done about it, I guess, as well. So for that, for this week, we've departed, of course, from the textbook, and I've given you this report from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism to read. First things first, this is from 2016, obviously, so it's very much in the immediate kind of aftermath of the Trump election, and of Brexit and everything else that happened around those years. And of course, things have moved on quite a bit further since then. But having said that, the findings that they have here, that they present here, the patterns that they present overall are still very much in place. And what's interesting and what's useful about this is also that, contrary to so much of the focus on Trump, and what I've shown you so far has been very much about the US as well, this is very explicitly focusing on Europe as well. So it's actually more useful for our purposes, more interesting for our purposes. It gives us a much clearer idea of really what's happening across Europe as well. And what they find, and we'll go through this in a moment, but what they find is that there are some very clear differences also between what has been traditionally Western and Northern Europe and Eastern and Southern Europe in the way that these fact checkers work, in what they're trying to address, in the kind of operational and perhaps even ideological stances that they've got. So that is, I think, also particularly useful to have a look at, because again, it takes us away from just saying, well, everything works the way it works in the US, which is patently not true, and more towards, well, how do these things work across Europe, across different European nations as well. There isn't much in here, I have to say, about Switzerland, and that may be perhaps because the problem is not as significant in Switzerland, or perhaps because they've simply looked elsewhere. But you might also want to keep in mind, as we're going through this, what you've seen of fact-checking here, and where perhaps Swiss fact-checkers are located in the context of all of this as well, how they operate, how they position themselves, what they choose to fact-check, and so on. Okay. So they kind of really see these outlets, these operations, these activities as very much something that is in support of democracy, of democratization in some cases, of building democracy or protecting it as well as a new democratic institution. And they speak particularly of these organizations as independent political fact checkers as well. So that's actually quite important, of course, that these fact checkers are not operating on behalf of a particular political party or perspective, but that they are independent and are fairly and in a balanced way, I guess, checking statements right across the political spectrum. And then they make this distinction, and we'll go through this in some detail, between a number of different ways that they position themselves. The first model is as reporters, basically alongside or as journalists. And that's really the closest to the traditional form of journalism that, of course, has checked facts in the past as well. Fact-checking itself is not entirely new, but turning this into a separate function of journalism is certainly the new thing. So that's one model, as journalists, working as news reporters. The second model is working as reformers, promoting institutional development, promoting improvements to politics or the news media, and that perhaps is particularly prominent in countries where democracy itself is a relatively new development, particularly in the countries of Eastern Europe, and where perhaps the news media themselves also still have significant problems because of their closeness to parties or because of corruption or other challenges as well. So these are the two kind of main models that they see an alignment with journalism or a much greater independence that really is pushing for further democratic reform. And then finally, there's also a category that they've identified where perhaps they position themselves more as independent experts. So really not so much taking a journalistic approach, not so much taking an approach that says democracy needs to develop further, but more as think tanks that have expertise on particular issues or topics as well. So that's the three models essentially that we'll see a bit more of. And that's the lens that they use essentially to analyze these categories, these types of fact-checking organizations across Europe as well. So let's go through those and say a bit more about how they operate. So this is fact-checkers as reporters to begin with. And what they identify is in the first place that, these people still are in some ways journalists or see themselves as journalists, whether they've come through a formal journalistic training or not, whether they're formally aligned with journalistic organizations or not, but their mission is to inform the public, to correct, obviously, misstatements, to correct false information, but to do so essentially as a journalist would do, correcting the statements and informing the public. So that's maybe also most similar to some of the examples that I've shown you already, particularly in outlets like the BBC or the Guardian or the New York Times or the Washington Post, where again there are in-house fact-checkers who are trying to correct the misstatements, the lies of politicians. So that's also very much rejecting any kind of sense of activism in terms of the reformation of democracy, attempts to change the system. These fact-checkers really take much more of simply an explanatory approach, finding misstatements by politicians, explaining why they're wrong, providing the correct information, and thereby hoping to inform the public without necessarily any aim to change politics or to change democracy or to change the institutions of democracy in any significant kind of way. This is in some ways the traditional ethos of journalism as being objective and disinterested, rather than taking any kind of side in all of this. They take the side perhaps of the truth, but beyond that they're not taking any side in terms of politics itself. And increasingly too, and this is something that probably has continued further since this report was published in 2016, a lot of this ends up focusing on data, on statistics, and uses data journalism techniques as well, partly because, of course, well, statistics are somewhat easier to fact check. If Boris Johnson, for instance, again says that the UK is spending £350 million per week on the EU, then that can be fact-checked and checked against the official records, and then of course it can be said that that's not true, and it's only 250 million or whatever. So a lot of this kind of work is easier in a sense when you've got clear statements about statistics, about amounts of money, about percentages of the population or whatever else, and that can be checked against the official statistics that bureaus of statistics and so on actually provide. In some cases also, this requires some level of investigative reporting, of course. Sometimes, particularly, to start with the statistics, sometimes these data points are not as freely and as readily available as perhaps they should be, so it might require investigation, it might require journalists to do journalistic work in the core sense and investigate, rather than just access statistics from some official government website. So this also is, again, a core journalistic function, ultimately, that this kind of fact-checking engages in. And that's, as they say, particularly important in Eastern Europe, where official statistical information, official government information is not as public as we've come to be used to it in Western European countries and elsewhere. In most Western countries, the standard economic statistics or other statistics are basically readily available from national bureaus of statistics or the various government departments or open data repositories that governments might have. This is less developed in a number of Eastern European countries, and it requires what's called freedom of information requests, where journalists make an official request to some government department or other body to access specific information. That information is not necessarily provided directly to journalists. So that's already one of the key differences between Eastern post-Soviet countries and Western nations in what they've found. Okay, so that's the reporter side of the story. The fact-checkers that position themselves more as reformers of democracy, of institutions, of politics, of their countries in some cases, really take a different approach. They are much more explicitly activist, and that might also mean that they're pursuing perhaps a more ideological agenda, that they have a more clear, rather neutral political position. They are actually positioned in some form on the political spectrum. They have an agenda, basically, of political reform, as they say. So that's a very different approach from the objective and disinterested, balanced journalistic approach. These people are pursuing certain ends in their activities, and that those ends are usually to make the country and to make its political systems better, whatever better might mean in that context. They are often pursuing specific policy goals as well, and that might just be, better democratic institutions, less corruption, fewer other problems as well in all of this. These people are not necessarily describing themselves as journalists, but as activists, pro-democracy activists possibly, or other terms in that kind of space. And this is, maybe not surprisingly, more common in Eastern European countries, post-Soviet countries, where there are still democratic deficits, where there is still a substantial amount of corruption, where democracy itself is still new and democratic engagement amongst the general population is still limited. And where also there is just limited accountability for politicians and political parties. So this is, as they say here, this is democratic institution building. Building a more robust democracy, building more robust democratic institutions, fighting against corruption, fighting against misuse of the state, fighting against nepotism and so on. So, from the research that this team did, they found this particularly in the former Soviet Union, particularly in the Balkans countries, and the organizational model for the fact-checkers was really as non-government organizations, as activist organizations, very actively fighting against all of these problems, ongoing problems that still exist in these countries. So that's a very different positioning from the more journalistic approaches of the reporters, and very much suited to those particular countries, of course, where there is still a need to do all of this. That's not to say that there isn't the need to fight against corruption and so on, obviously in other more Western European countries, but it is perhaps particularly pronounced still in these post-Soviet countries. And that's really creating some tensions, I guess, with ordinary journalists as well, because they feel, these reformers feel that journalism is perhaps too complacent, has arranged itself too well with the political powers that rule the countries, and that perhaps the journalistic role of being objective and being disinterested is too limited for their purposes. These reformers need to be able to clearly say what's good for democracy and what's bad for democracy, what's good for the development of the country and what's bad for the development of the country. So being a journalist who just provides fairness and balance between all sides of politics is not appropriate for them necessarily. And that really, has an impact also on the way that they engage with mainstream news. The problem for some of these organizations in some of the countries that they cover is that mainstream news outlets themselves are highly or very closely connected with particular political parties as well. That many news organizations, including even public broadcasters, are perhaps towing the party line of whoever is in power at the time. So they are themselves not necessarily seen as credible, and therefore these fact checkers need to show that they're independent from these news outlets themselves. Which of course also makes it more difficult to circulate their content, and we'll get back to that in a minute as well. So the fact checks themselves, of course, reach the largest audiences if they're published by the largest news organizations. But when these news organizations themselves are part of the problem, then that means that they are not going to circulate the fact checks that perhaps also criticize them. And so then we have the problem of how we get the fact checks, how we make the fact checks visible, of course, to the general public without using the help of these news organizations. And this is, perhaps an even stronger statement about this. As they say here, nearly every fact checker in Eastern Europe said that major media outlets are, to some degree, partisan, corrupt, unreliable, dominated by powerful business and political interests. That's a pretty sad indictment, unfortunately, of the mainstream media, of the major media outlets across Eastern Europe. And it's, again, this is obviously from 2016. Hopefully things have improved to some extent over the last few years, but many of these problems will still be in place to a certain extent. So this is obviously then not a mainstream media that fact checkers can easily work with, because by doing so they would actually undermine their own credibility. And then really the challenge becomes making this kind of content visible, of course, to the general public without arranging themselves, without collaborating with these problematic mainstream media outlets as well. So that's the reformers. And then let's speak a little bit more about the experts here as well. That's again a slightly different category of fact checkers that has some overlaps with the first two, but that can also be seen as taking a distinct different approach. So these fact checkers are not necessarily just relying on their in-house fact-checking teams to say whether a claim is correct or not. They might have in-house experts on specific domains that they draw on. And in that case, they call themselves perhaps think tanks or act like think tanks on particular issues. So, for instance, on the economy, in recent years, on health communication around COVID, for instance, or on health policy more broadly as well. So that's perhaps how they define themselves. But also beyond that, they might draw on outside experts, of course, on topics where they haven't got that expertise, where they haven't got their own domain experts in-house. That's how these outlets position themselves. So you might have think tanks, again, on particular topics, or you might have them bring in their experts. Of course, and this is the overlap between other forms of fact-checking organizations that might not have a distinct domain expertise. Other fact-checkers also at times call on experts for their expertise, bring in these outside sources, particularly when things are especially complex and complicated. They don't necessarily rely just on their own investigation, but check this with the broader public as well. This is the broader expert community as well. This is, for instance, the case with Full Fact, which I've shown you already with the £350 million debunking. They have their own journalists doing fact-checking work, but then they also connect with academic researchers and others who have the domain expertise in the areas that they need to cover for their fact checks. So where perhaps it's easy enough to find the official statistics and correct what Boris Johnson or others have said, they can do that in-house, but when it comes to more complicated areas of fact-checking where perhaps there is a genuine dispute and where you need the expertise to really evaluate the claims, they will reach out to outside experts. And outside experts very often means academics, whether they are working for universities or think tanks or NGOs or other bodies that have a role to play in all of this. So that's where particularly our kind of community comes into all of this as well. An even more interesting model, and I'll spend a bit more time on this as we go, is the conversation. I'm just out of interest, how many people here are familiar with the conversation? Who's seen the site? Okay, yep. And that's partly, I think, because while it operates in a number of countries around the world and in English, it does not have any German, Italian, or, well, it has a French language, but it doesn't have German or Italian language outlets at this point, although I think they might be working on that. So this is, again, a slightly different model and not just limited to fact checks, but takes a really interesting approach, I think, to providing scholarly expertise and inserting that into the general debate. What the conversation does is essentially it's set up a site or a network of sites where academics, people like me, write articles on their topics of expertise, which are then processed by journalists in order to make them accessible to the general public without the underlying academic knowledge. And that is then very widely published and readily available also for republishing. Now, when they engage in fact checks particularly, they do the same. They draw on academics for their expertise, and the journalists working for the conversation take that expertise and turn it into fact checks on certain topics that they've selected. So there's a curation, there's an editing process going on here. And then, in fact, it's also, as it says there, reviewed by other scholars and given further comment from other academics. So it's quite an involved process that very directly and very centrally draws on the expertise of scholars. And that has been quite a successful model, not just for fact-checking overall, but for a broader kind of attempt to insert academic expertise basically into the public conversation as well on current topics. So I'd encourage you to actually check out the conversation. I'll say a bit more about it in a minute, but it's a really interesting model for academic publishing to a general audience, and has had some real impact in the world as well for all of that. Yeah, we'll have a bit more of a look at it in a minute. So just to go through then some of the sites, some of the ones that we've seen already and some of the ones that we haven't. This is a fairly recent fact check from the 2nd of November on a claim made by the new UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, saying a record number of new homes were built in the last year. Full fact, again, as an independent fact checker, providing a fact check that says, well, we haven't found any evidence to support this in the various official statistics, and the Prime Minister's office has also not provided any kind of fact checks. And then they go on there, as you see there at the bottom of this, experts told us, while recent building figures are higher than in some previous years, they're generally far lower than records set decades ago. So this is where expertise from outside experts is drawn into the fact check. It's not just now full fact checkers themselves doing this work and essentially doing, well, they did the research, obviously, they checked the official statistics, they couldn't find anything, and then they went to the experts for further expertise, for further detail, to better understand whether there's any truth to this claim or not. And, you know, as you go on then into the article itself, just to give you a bit of a picture of this, you see there experts being referred to very directly. Christian Hilber, Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics, Paul Cheshire, Emeritus Professor of Economic Geography at LSE. So you get the direct kind of expertise from scholars being put in there as well, from experts in the field being put in there as well. It's no longer just based on the fact-checkers' analysis themselves, but on a lot of other expertise drawn in from the outside as well. So this is really that expert model, I guess, in this case combined with the reporter-based model that Full Fact otherwise embraces. So that's where these two models kind of combine essentially to enhance the fact checks further and provide much more detailed background and verification as well. Now, I want to say a bit more about the conversation because, again, I think it's an interesting example. This is what it looks like. This is what its generic European front page looks like or looked like a few days ago. And you see there the sorts of things that it covers, obviously quite a bit there on the Climate Change Summit, a whole bunch of fairly topical things that might have been, might have been topical at the time, so very much related to the news as well. And again, I want to stress not all of this is, of course, fact-checking. Some of that is simply academic engagement with the topics of the day. And then you've got things like the Marcel Proust article, which isn't really topical or isn't really timely, but is simply, academic expertise being made accessible to a much larger audience. But if we then look at something like the COP27 article that you saw there on the front page, for instance, this is very directly, of course, responding to the fact that the Climate Change Summit was at that point about to happen and is addressing some of those key questions that, of course, are connected with climate change. How responsible are we as industrialized countries for climate change? And what moral responsibility do we have to do something about it then? And then if you look closely, and I'll zoom into this a little bit, this happens to be written by two people from France, so you see this in French, but then you see that ultimately the authors of this are not journalists, are not fact-checkers, but an honorary professor and a director of research, an emeritus director of research from the Université Grenoble-Alpes. So this is the kind of model of the conversation ultimately to provide what looks like journalistic content, what reads like journalistic content, as written by scholarly experts in their field, eminent scholarly experts in their field. So that's the publishing model of the conversation, and in a sense, well beyond fact-checking itself, it is one of those new models. I mean, this has been going now since 2011, so it's no longer quite new, but it is one of those emerging models of new forms of journalism that do something somewhat different from the traditional mainstream media as well. And for that, it is quite an interesting enterprise. And there is kind of a German language version of this, although it's a lot more limited in how it operates. And this is something, again, that you might have come across already, the science media centers. There are science media centers around the world. This happens to be the one from Germany, who, again, a few days ago really published something on the challenge of disinformation, obviously in German in this case. And what they do essentially is pick out specific topics from time to time, and for those topics ask experts for their expertise, and from this develop dossiers essentially on those topics to make available to the mainstream media to inform their reporting. So this is not quite fact-checking, it's almost in a sense preempting the fact-checking ahead of time by providing the scientific expertise to journalists that they can then incorporate into their own articles. So what that then looks like is that they ask certain questions of the academics, and those academics then provide a statement based on their expertise on those topics. I'm not so worried about you reading all of this, but that's the format essentially that this takes. And again, this then can end up in mainstream news reporting and is in some ways designed particularly to enhance the reporting in more minor news outlets that don't have the capacity to have an expert journalist who deals with disinformation, for instance. it's often those kinds of news outlets that are most susceptible to problematic information, of course, because they simply don't have the depth of staff to deal with all of these topics and have expert journalists on staff. So for those minor outlets, having some ready-made expertise that they can draw on, that they can cite in their own articles when it comes to reporting about disinformation, for instance, in this case, is valuable, of course, because it gives them ready-made content, quality content to work with as they address these kinds of topics. Okay, so that's kind of the three models, essentially, of fact-checking that the report outlines: reporters, reformers, experts, and of course, some overlap between them as well. Let's talk a bit more about how they're organized then as well. So the report itself essentially speaks of the need, of course, to be balanced. That's really what comes through clearly, to be reliable in what they do, and to be transparent in their work. And that's, of course, largely because as a fact checker, you rely on your credibility to be intact. If you're a fact checker who's been shown to do poor work, if you do a fact check and it turns out that you yourself got your facts wrong, that can undermine not just that particular fact check, but your whole operation very fundamentally, of course. So fact checkers need to be absolutely crystal clear about the quality of their work, about how they're doing their work, who they're drawing on in their work. They can't run the risk of drawing on some dodgy figures themselves, of course. And of course, in many cases, they need to be very careful not to appear as biased in the way that they're, say, only checking people from the left or only people from the right of politics, because then again, they could be seen as part of a particular ideological side, and that in itself would also be deeply problematic, of course. So fact checkers absolutely rely, maybe even more than journalists, on being perceived as independent, transparent, well-balanced, accurate, objective, and all of that. That goes to some extent even for the ones that see themselves as reformers. Even though they might be pushing for democratic reform, they still need to make sure that they absolutely get their facts right and that they're not seen as just being ideological in their work and pushing for something without the evidence to back it up. So that's maybe a fairly obvious statement, but it is absolutely crucial and critical, of course, for fact-checking to operate in this kind of way. The broad focus of fact-checkers tends to be on politics. That's perhaps not surprising because, of course, well, politics makes policy, politics runs countries, so political actors themselves, whether they're in power or not, have a lot of impact, and their statements, their activities have a significant amount of impact, of course. So it's perhaps not surprising that there is a significant focus on political actors first and foremost. There is a lot less focus, but some, and in some countries more than others, then also on journalists, on news media more broadly, and other public figures. But that's a lot less widespread, and there are, of course, reasons for that as well. As the report says, only just under 1/4 of all fact-checking organizations actually also fact-check other media outlets. And that's, in part because perhaps they see themselves as part of the media, and fact-checking your colleagues is problematic in some ways, might just cause a lot of bad blood. Perhaps in some countries, the media are actually operating reasonably well, and there's less need for fact-checking. But this can also, of course, this lack of fact-checking on media outlets can also, of course, be a problem, particularly where media outlets themselves might be part of the problem, might be highly biased, and are publishing problematic information in their own right. In part, all of this is also simply driven by resource limits, and we'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Many of these fact-checking organizations are simply very small operations as well, so they need to concentrate on perhaps the most impactful statements, the most problematic actors, And that might just be the leading politicians in a country. They can't check everything, of course. They simply haven't got the time or the money to do that. So the only way that, the only things that they can focus on is perhaps the politicians themselves. And this is kind of problematic as well. In many of these organizations, there is a clear, not so much preference, but a clear focus on the politicians and parties that are in power rather than the opposition. And that can, of course, then be seen or can be perceived as bias, as political bias. That people are fact-checking the left more than the right, or the right more than the left, and that therefore perhaps they have their own political agendas. But in part, it's also simply about the nature of opposition and the nature of government. Politicians and parties in government need to be more specific, often at least are more specific about the statements and the claims that they're making, particularly when they are advocating for perhaps new policies, new laws. Opposition parties have the freedom to be a lot vaguer in many things, saying we will fix things, but not necessarily providing plans exactly for how they're going to do so. And of course, if they just say we will create jobs without saying how they're going to do that, that's not something that lends itself to fact-checking. If a government says we have this new program and it will create tens of thousands of jobs, that's a lot more possible to fact-check than a statement that just says, well, the world will be better if you elect us. So that's part of the reason also that there is a disproportionate focus normally on the parties in power, the parties in government, rather than opposition parties. And the final problem, and this is also quite a significant one, is of course that fact-checking can be misused, can be operationalized by those who benefit from what the fact-checks say. So people, if your political opponent gets fact-checked and it turns out to that what they've said is incorrect, then of course you will use that and say, aha, my opponent is lying. That's maybe just in the nature of politics, but of course if you get fact-checked and it turns out that what you've said isn't true, then you're not actually going to acknowledge that. So very often these fact-checks are being used by the other side as well to attack politicians. Maybe rightly so in some cases, but that also means that there is a lot of political debate around the fact-checks themselves, and that may ultimately draw the fact-checkers themselves into these political debates and undermine their standing as independent, credible arbiters of politics. They may themselves end up, there may be claims about them basically in their political stance. Arguably, we've seen this, for instance, to step away from Europe here for a moment, with the way that the New York Times, the Washington Post, and others have been attacked by the Trump camp as being part of the fake news media and of the liberal media and so on, of course, for fact-checking Trump on his endless, feed of false claims. Eventually, the people who are being fact-checked and who don't like it will say, but you're just part of the other side, you're part of my political enemies, rather than, okay, I accept that you are genuinely an independent fact-checking organization. And this is, I think, one of the starkest kind of graphs from all of this as well, showing the budget in 2016, of course, in this case, but again, this will not have changed much, that these fact-checking organizations have. So nearly half of them, 44%, operate on a budget of less than $20,000 US for the entire year. So this is in some ways really for many of them a labor of love, something that they do on the side, something that they do with very, very limited resources, with very, very limited staff numbers. Only about a quarter or so of them have budgets from $100,000 and above. And if you think about what that amount of money buys you in terms of your staff, your operational costs, your website operation, all of that, it doesn't really go very far. So most of these organizations have very few staff, maybe no full-time staff whatsoever, and that of course very directly limits the amount of fact-checking they can do, the amount of facts they can check, and also is a reason that they will focus on the most problematic claims, perhaps the most visible and the most outrageous claims, perhaps only the claims by leading politicians rather than by other stakeholders as well. So this is ultimately the reason that fact-checking itself remains quite limited in its focus, because simply they don't have the budget to do anything more. And that obviously is deeply problematic as well. And this goes, by the way, even for fact-checking organizations or units that are aligned with mainstream news outlets, because while, let's say, the BBC certainly has a large budget, only a small subset of that is directed to its fact-checking units. Even when they are aligned with these mainstream media outlets, they don't necessarily have a massive budget either, unfortunately. So, here again, this is the question of, well, how are they set up and who are they connected with? So, and this is a slightly confusing way of putting this, unfortunately. The second part is more important. The majority of these outlets are operating as independent ventures, as projects of civil society organizations, as outlets that are not attached to established news organizations. There is a subset that is attached to mainstream news organizations, but that's not the majority of them. And that's, again, what we see quite clearly in the budgets that they have. A lot of them are simply working in a very independent kind of fashion. That makes them very precarious, of course. That means, again, that they don't have many staff. That means that they are just really subject to a lot of financial stress, and ultimately also potentially legal stress if they should get sued by someone that they fact-checked. That can very easily put them out of business as well. So they're in a very precarious situation, and that's of course deeply problematic, particularly in countries where this kind of fact-checking is very sorely needed. And again, there is a clear distinction here between the north and west of Europe and everywhere else. It's in, well, frankly, the rich and older democracies in the north and west of Europe, where they are connected by more mainstream legacy newsrooms. Again, the BBC is an example of this. But in the rest of Europe, they are much more on their own and much more precarious. So in the countries perhaps that possibly need them the most, they are in the worst financial and operational situation. So in the east and the south of Europe, they are operating almost entirely as NGOs, as alternative media outlets. They position themselves very deliberately as an alternative to mainstream conventional journalism, because in part mainstream conventional journalism in a number of these countries is part of the problem, because it is so aligned with significant political power as well. So that's deeply problematic. Where it is needed the most, fact-checking is at its most precarious, unfortunately. And of course, yeah, if you are attached to a mainstream newsroom, well, you may still not have massive resources, but you can at least connect with mainstream journalists and engage with them and work with them on major fact-checking tasks. If you're doing all of this on your own and maybe even against the opposition of mainstream news outlets, then all of this becomes a huge deal more difficult and problematic. And that means that, as it says here too, many of them have come and gone. Many of them exist only for a relatively brief period of time because they cannot find the ongoing funding for the work that they do. And that is even the case for some of the ones that have been attached to mainstream media outlets. If the BBC says, yes, we want to have a fact-checking unit, and then at some point they say, well, actually, let's just fold this back into our standard journalistic operations, then a lot of this ends up going away, and even those mainstream fact-checking units will disappear again. And again, as I've said, part of the problem with all of this is also that it's one thing to do the fact checks and to perhaps put them out on your website, but how do you get them in front of people? And particularly, how do you get them in front of the people who've seen the original false claims as well? This is one of the fundamental challenges for fact-checking, of course. If, again, let's just take Donald Trump as an example. If Donald Trump says something wrong and that's reported, by Fox News or whatever, how do you make the fact check of that by the New York Times or the Washington Post visible to the same people who watch Fox News? That's almost impossible, even if you have the operations of the New York Times or the Washington Post behind you. But in most other cases, that's even more difficult, of course, because you may not even have that publishing power of another major news organization that you can draw on. So how do you ultimately make this kind of content visible to the rest of the world once you've done your fact check? I'm assuming, for instance, that none of you previously have gone to the Full Fact website that I've shown before. That's because we don't normally see these kinds of sites in our day-to-day activity unless we're really, really interested in politics. So it is actually when other news outlets report about these fact checks that they become a lot more visible. But if those news outlets themselves are part of the problem, of course, then that doesn't actually happen either. So that's where collaborations come into play. This is again an Australian example. This is what's called RMIT ABC Fact Check. These are all the fact checks that they've published via the public broadcast in Australia, the ABC. And when you look closely there, this explains how this whole thing actually operates. And this is a model that we've seen more and more now. So this is what fact check does. It determines the accuracy of claims by politicians and so on. It is jointly funded and a partnership between RMIT University and the ABC, combining academic excellence and the best of Australian journalism. Well, that's obviously fairly self-glorifying as well, but essentially the point is that this is a partnership between an academic institution that's actually doing the fact checks and the media organization that is both saying, here are some things that we think should be checked by you academics, and then provides the public platform to disseminate the results of those fact checks as well. So that's a model that we've seen emerge more and more, at least in countries where there are, of course, independent quality news outlets that are willing to publish these kinds of fact checks. Again, if, of course, the media themselves are part of the problem, then this is not a viable option for fact checkers. You cannot collaborate with a news outlet that in itself is part of the problem. Also of interest, by the way, is that, of course, by now there is an international fact-checking network which has a code of principles, and that quality fact-checkers will be members of, will have signed up to that code of principles as well. And then as it goes on there, that then even has a complaints process if people feel that the fact-checking organization has got something wrong, has not accurately fact-checked certain topics. So that's, I think, a fairly workable, fairly common model now for the way that fact-checkers operate. Again, only, of course, if there is a news organization with enough independent credentials and quality, ultimately, that can do this kind of work as well. And then, again, there's the model of the conversation. I want to say a little bit more about this as well. So what the conversation does is slightly different. It operates as an independent website and has become, for quite a few users, a news source in its own right because of what it does and how it covers things. And here's just a random example of a story, for instance, that was published there recently on the 6th of November. This is related, obviously, to the US midterms, and it basically talks about how you manage the uncertainty and the stress around that. The topic itself doesn't really matter so much, but the way it then operates is that it publishes all of its content under a Creative Commons license. Now, some of you hopefully have heard of Creative Commons licenses. Yeah, anyone? No? Okay. Creative Commons is a form of, is an alternative to copyright, essentially, that retains some rights by the author, but also makes these things free to republish. And it's quite widespread now for all forms of creative content, of copyrighted content. So what the conversation does with each article is to include this and say, well, our articles can be republished, can be reused by other media outlets. And if you look at this article, this is actually what's happened here. So this is the same article published by Yahoo News, even with the same image being used, and credited there to Bethany Teachman, professor of psychology, University of Virginia, who wrote the original conversation article. Here it is with a little bit of editing, a little bit of alteration in CNN as well. 10 tips to manage uncertainty and stress around the midterm elections. And with the disclaimer, with the note saying CNN is showcasing the work of the conversation, collaboration between journalists and academics to provide news analysis and commentary. The content is produced solely by the conversation. So there you've got even very mainstream outlets like CNN, obviously, reusing this kind of content that was published ultimately by an academic in the conversation under a Creative Commons license. And that's the conversations model for making this kind of content very widely visible, enabling it to be very widely republished in mainstream news outlets as well. So that's another way, and this goes for generic articles like this, but certainly also for the fact checks that they publish. That's another way to try and make this content much more widely visible in public conversation, in the public debate, by enabling any news outlet to republish this content without having to worry about copyright implications or anything else. So that's one of the really smart innovations that the conversation came up with as they did this. And of course, again, I've shown you the Science Media Center approach, which is less providing these kinds of full stories for republication, but simply providing a dossier of essentially quotable quotes that journalists can incorporate into their own stories without having to go through the trouble of interviewing experts and academics themselves. That process has been done for them already, and the quotes are being made available for ready use in their articles as well. So that's all fine. So that's how these fact checkers operate. This is how they're organized. Really, ultimately, the question, of course, is, well, does it make any difference? Does it work in any way? Does it have any kind of impact? Does it stop Donald Trump from lying, to put it really bluntly? And that it doesn't, of course. That might be a bit too much to ask for fact-checking organizations with often very small budgets, of course. So first off, as I've said, while, of course, they can all put their content online, it will really only have any meaningful impact if it's being picked up by legacy media, by mainstream media, and that might mean really building relationships with those media outlets, of course. Just by building a website, you can't rely on audiences actually finding that, reading those fact checks and saying, oh yeah, okay, so Donald Trump's wrong, I'm not going to believe him anymore. You've got to get this in front of people by working with mainstream media. And again, that makes it particularly difficult for those Southern and Eastern European countries where there are significant democracy deficits and where the media themselves are a problem. What then can they hope to accomplish if they can't always get this stuff in front of mainstream audiences? I mean, the picture, again, this is where we kind of come back to the US, obviously. The picture from the US certainly is not a good one. As they say there, the debate in the US seems to be very disconnected from, and Trump has lied relentlessly, has kept lying relentlessly, has kept lying over the last 4 years as well, even after he was no longer president. To begin with, about obviously the fact that he did lose the election. So these figures, people like Trump and others who have built their career basically on making these false statements and getting away with it, are not going to change their stripes. They're not going to change the way that they operate, however much you fact check them. So while the effort of the New York Times and Washington Post in tracking all of those lies over the course of his presidency is noble, perhaps, and honorable, but it's really not going to change the way that particularly Trump supporters feel about him. However, in less extreme cases, it can still have an impact, and it can still perhaps, I kind of want to say, discipline politicians who are prone to lying from time to time. For one, while it might not reach the absolute hardcore supporters of populists and propagandists who have built their career on lying, it might still reach those who are just curious about what Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or anyone else is saying, and provide them with the actual accurate evidence that may keep them from believing these politicians' lies. It may also at times inhibit political lying itself if politicians are repeatedly found to have lied, and if in their countries that still carries some kind of sanction, then of course that may stop them from lying so obviously, at least in future. At least in some circumstances, certainly not in the case of Donald Trump. But, and this is really one of the takeaways from this entire report, it very rarely changes the world. It doesn't yield dramatic, permanent breakthroughs. It's not going to, again, stop Donald Trump from lying. That's too much to ask of fact-checking, particularly of these really small, independent fact-checking operations, of course. But it does have some impact on the world. It does, have at least, it does change the course of political debate, at least to a limited extent. And that's better than nothing, of course. But we've also seen politicians adjust their communication styles to all of this. So this is from a Serbian fact-checker who says that, well, our politicians are becoming more and more skilled, rhetorically skilled, to avoid concrete promises and statements. It's just something in the clouds, something nebulous. So there is nothing to be checked. And I believe they do it on purpose. It's better to tell something stupid like that than to risk and say something that might be checked. And this, I think, is almost certainly not limited to Serbia. There is perhaps a general move towards making more generic statements rather than being precise about the impact that your policies or policy proposals will have. So rather than saying we will create, 1 million new jobs within the first year that we're going to be in government, in the end it might just be, well, jobs will create jobs. The first of these you can fact check after the fact. The second of those you can't, not in any kind of meaningful way. So politicians, as a result of fact checking, have changed the way that they speak by making less specific statements, by saying more generally, elect us and it'll be good for you, but not necessarily saying how exactly it's going to be good for you. So that doesn't quite put fact-checkers out of business, of course, but it certainly makes fact-checking a lot more difficult, as she says. Similarly, does it affect the actual politicians who've been caught lying, making misstatements? Here's a French fact-checker from Le Monde saying, take the example of Nicolas Sarkozy. There are errors stated, false things, which he has said for 10 years. That is, it's not just one verification, it's 6, 7, 8, 10 verifications. So he's been found to say the wrong thing, to repeat a misstatement, to repeat a lie 10 times or more, but that's never prevented him from continuing to say this. So even if he's caught saying this, he will just repeat the lie over and over and over again. And that, of course, we've seen with Donald Trump even more so. even though there is no evidence for any kind of vote tampering in the last election, he will continue to say the vote was stolen and I'm the real winner and all of that. So that's because he knows that his listeners, his flocks, will not get their information from me as the fact checker to check if what he's saying is true or false. So the real hardcore supporters of these populist politicians are not going to read the fact checks. Or in fact, if they're reading the fact checks, they're going to say, yeah, that fact checker is obviously working for the other side, so I can't believe that person either. And as he says, then also that's the same problem with Trump, of course. I looked the other day at the number of fact checks that there have been on Trump, and that does not prevent him from climbing in the polls. And again, we might see some of that again now that he's declared his new campaign. So that's, of course, one of the big limitations, that the fact checks are not going to convince the really hardcore supporters of the politicians who've been found lying that they are in fact lying. Because those hardcore supporters are really just going to say, well, you know, Le Monde has always been against Sarkozy, so of course I'm not going to trust the fact checker who works for Le Monde or something like that. The Washington Post, the New York Times, they're part of the liberal mainstream, lamestream, fake stream, whatever media, so of course Trump supporters are not going to believe what they're saying. And fundamentally that's a sign of deep polarization in a society, and of course it means that, the fact-checking cannot solve that problem, and it shouldn't be expected to solve such deep problems as, for instance, the US has in the way that it's polarized politically and otherwise. And of course, then finally, this fact-checking again can also be weaponized. So I've talked a little bit about already the way that, of course, if your political opponent is fact-checked, then you can use that for your own political gain, perhaps. But we've seen also the emergence of very distinctly political fact-checking operations that target a particular enemy. This is one that you may have come across before, EU versus Disinfo, which was set up to very, very deliberately and very openly set up to debunk Russian mis- and disinformation directed at the EU. If you look under the hood, it says that EU versus Disinfo is a project of the European Action Services East Stratcom Task Force, which sounds all very military and organized, established in 2015 to better forecast, address, and respond to the Russian Federation's ongoing disinformation campaigns against the European Union, its member states, and countries in the shared neighborhood. So this is not an independent or a balanced fact checker. It is very obviously directly targeting Russian disinformation. It's doing so for a good reason, because there is a lot of Russian disinformation around, frankly, but of course it can easily then also be attacked by the other side for saying, well, you're obviously ideological, you're obviously against us, of course you're going to keep saying that what we publish is unbalanced and is wrong. So this is in some ways taking the fact-checking model, but very specifically using it to target another side. And this is, by the way, the sort of stuff that they do. This is, again, a recent screenshot of all the false claims that Russian media are making themselves, or that are starting to appear perhaps in other, sometimes European outlets as well. So they are tracing also the dissemination of these claims through media in order to perhaps prevent them from becoming visible in more mainstream outlets. So that's a kind of a weaponized form of fact-checking against Russia, and you know, frankly, for good reason, but still it's a form of weaponizing fact-checking against a common enemy. Of course, then what happens, and also, by the way, this is what that then looks like. They pick out a claim, saying that, you know, all the claims of Russian influence in US elections are just old accusations that are trying to justify Democrat defeat, and then they have a long statement disproving this as well. But of course, then we also see the opposite of that. So Russia itself has then set up a site that is very disingenuously called War on Fakes, which is essentially doing the same the other way around, claiming that there is a massive European disinfo operation that's targeting Russia. So this is a website, a Telegram channel operated from Russia that is claiming to be a fact-checking service, countering the information war that's been launched against Russia. And it ironically has been fact-checked in itself as well. So PolitiFact, another fact-checking service, has fact-checked this supposed Russian fact-checking service called War on Fakes to show that its fact-checks are pieces of pro-Russian disinformation packed with falsehoods about the situation in Ukraine. So if you're still with me, this is a fact-checker fact-checking, a pseudo-fact-checking site that says that it's fact-checking European disinformation. And that's really ultimately, that's the sort of information war, of course, that we now live in, particularly since the start of the invasion of Ukraine. But actually, of course, EU versus disinfo was set up well before that, after the annexation of the Crimean. So here we see really ultimately the use of fact-checking itself as a weapon in the information war between Europe, or the West perhaps more broadly, and Russia under Putin. This is ultimately perhaps a challenge for fact-checkers themselves, because if you've got these kinds of operations calling themselves fact-checkers, how do you tell these from genuine quality fact-checking operations? In much the same way, of course, that we've got literally fake news sites that look like news, but all they do is push disinformation from various sources that have set themselves up to look like genuine quality news outlets. And again, it is sometimes difficult to tell those quality news outlets from these copycats that are made to look like real news, but provide all sorts of mis and disinformation. So this is ultimately, again, the weaponization of news and of fact-checking in this particular case, in this information war that is currently raging alongside, of course, the actual war in Ukraine. So what then? Will we just have all of these partisan fact-checking sites that are pushing various political agendas, and will real fact-checking, if you like, be drowned out essentially by these organizations? Partly also because, well, if they're run by Russia, or frankly, if they're run by the EU as well, these outlets will have much better resources, better staffing in most cases, than all of those little fact-checking sites that we've talked about so far. So that, to me, is a real challenge and a real danger for fact-checking, to just be drawn into this war and to be overwhelmed, essentially, by all of these new sites that may be coming along. All right, and that's it for today. On that happy note, sorry. So next time we're going back to the textbook, and as I've said, we'll end up looking more at the broader kind of picture of what the public sphere, or the public spheres perhaps, look like now, with all the changes that we've seen throughout the semester, with all these developments, with the growing and very big role, of course, that online and social media now play, with the structures of communication that have emerged from that as well. So for that, we'll go back to the textbook, and it's chapter 8 of the book to read, please, for that one. But that's it for today, so thank you all, and I'll see you next week.